honored friends, and welcome to the Radical Emergence podcast, where we're having conversations at the edge of transformation. We are your hosts. I'm Dr. Jen Pierre-Rich, and with me is my friend, co-host, and co-collaborator, Dr. Sally Adnams Jones. Please check out our bios in the show notes, where you'll find links to our work, websites, and can find ways to connect with us. If you're not already following, hit that subscribe button, ring that bell, and join our mailing list so you can stay up to date on new episodes as they drop.
Hello, everybody. Sally here. This exciting project consists of about 26 episodes in all, dedicated to better defining and understanding transformation on all its levels of reality. That's personal, social, as well as ecological. We're going to ask, what is transformation? Why bother? Why do we need it? And what does it feel like or look like? We'll also ask, can we induce it or perhaps accidentally block it? These are really important questions for growth.
We draw not only on our hard-won life experience, we are also transdisciplinarians. So what the heck is that? Well, it means we want to understand transformation from as many lenses as possible, including formal academic disciplines and discourses, art, media, and popular culture. Importantly, we draw from our living experience.
So we are experts, so to speak, but mostly in just one small but highly critical area, our own suffering, and the medicines that we've both used to transform our own lives. So to this end, we've also added decades of committed practices, as well as formal degrees, including specific in-depth studies in the mechanisms of transformation, because we needed to understand this healing journey for ourselves.
Does this entitle us to help others? You bet. Absolutely. Because it is by sharing our stories, knowledge, and direct experience that we offer sane, sober, practical tools for living on the ground of life. So welcome. Strap in, hang on, and enjoy the ride as we deep dive into a universe of transformation. We are delighted to be back with you again here on the Radical Emergence podcast, where we are having conversations at the edge of transformation. It is an honor and privilege to be here with my friend and colleague, my playmate in all things transformation, Dr. Sally Adnams Jones, who is one of the preeminent thinkers, scholars, and educators on creativity and transformation. So I know she's going to have endless gems to share with us in this episode, as she does in every episode. So are you ready to go, Sally?
Oh, this is absolute privilege and honor to do this with you, dear Jen.
Same. All right, let's go. So in last week's episode, we talked about developmental models and developmental theories and maps, and how we can use those models consciously to advance our growth and healing, which is what we're all about on this podcast. So this week, we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about peak experiences. And to be honest, this is an exhaustive topic. And we are a transdisciplinary show, so we try to look at things from as many perspectives as possible, but we don't want to be overwhelming in our content that we give you. So we're going to try to do our best, but recognizing that we can't do it all. So if something piques your interest in the show, or you have questions, or you want us to go further in on something, let us know. We always love to hear from you. Your feedback is really important to us. So how do we define a peak experience? there are those experiences in life that are incredibly intense, psychologically, spiritually, physically. Sometimes these experiences come with a sense of transcendence, deep joy, peace. And these kind of profound experiences, these peak experiences, often lead us to big, profound changes in our values and our understanding and how we make meaning in the world. So peak experiences really connect us to something much bigger than ourselves, and they're often catalysts for major changes in our lives. In the upper part of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he describes how we have these peak experiences. They are high points when we feel totally at one, in harmony with ourselves, with others, with our environment. So I want you to imagine, close your eyes and imagine a time where you felt joy of the purest kind. You know, maybe it was your wedding day or the birth of a child. Could it be a mystical experience, a spiritual experience, a religious experience? It could be a sense of oneness and revelation in nature. It could be a psychedelic experience, or it could be a sexual or a creative or a musical experience. It could be a combination of any of those. There have been moments in my life where I've been so overwhelmed with love or compassion that I have been like, it feels like totally transported into another dimension. And I'm sure you felt that way too. And that's called unity consciousness, right? Where the boundaries between me and the world are totally dissolved, and there's just this sense of oneness, right? And so I've talked about that I had a transformative experience in my backyard over a decade ago. I've talked about this on the podcast, where I had a breakdown. And it was a profound peak experience where I dipped into an alternate state. And in that state, I recognized and felt grokked our oneness with everything. And that was very different than my ordinary state of consciousness. And that was in that experience that I realized that, you know, we're not separate from each other, that I'm not separate from the world. I'm not separate from nature. You know, I started recognizing a lot of illusions about myself in that breakdown. I was communing with trees. They were communing with me through the feedback loops that are available to us in nature. And the trees were teaching me how to be present with myself. They were teaching me how to retrieve my wounded selves and bring them into the light of my awareness. And that was a mystical experience. It was a peak experience, a transformative experience. And I have been integrating that experience for years. And we are going to talk about and point to why integration is vital to integrating these peak experiences. Because they're life-changing, they're sacred, very meaningful and fulfilling. And when we feel these experiences, we can feel totally alive. Our perceptions are altered, our senses are heightened. But these experiences can also be overwhelming, and without the proper support, they can become very confusing and painful. So one thing Sally and I are going to really press in this episode is that we have the proper supports that we need when we have these peak experiences. Because when we add, you know, without those proper supports, and you add perhaps mental health issues on top of that, there's a real possibility of destabilization and disintegration, which that's not what we're looking for. So it's so important to have supports, family, friends, professionals, companion animals, nature, the trees. We need also to share these stories of peak experiences and transformation with each other so that we can learn with each other and normalize them, right, as part of the transformative experience. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to give it to Sally, and we're going to go deeper about peak experiences. I'm super excited. Over to you, Sally.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you again for sharing your story, and really helps listeners understand that this is real for you as it is for me. This is not something we read in a book. And I can honestly say that experiencing altered states saved my life. And I'll explain why. But first of all, I'd like to share with listeners that there's a spectrum of well-being that we can all experience, from deep funks and depressions to oscillations between moods, to coming out of those, stabilizing into high functioning, and then what a lot of people have referred to in the past several thousand years, states of enlightenment, which are permanent stages of ecstasy that are not dependent on our external circumstances. Wow, that is a possibility for all of us now, not just religious elites, and it changes everything. That's why Jen and I want to talk about this. It's so important. But if you've never experienced that, it's a bit like if somebody has, and they're trying to describe that to someone who hasn't, it's a bit like trying to tell a younger kid about an orgasm. They can't imagine it because they've never experienced it. And not only that, it might not be ethical to start telling people about possibilities when they can't even conceive of it. So Jen and I are going to be really demystifying of this experience, and we're going to stay really practical, and we're going to draw heavily on the science, because this is no longer esoteric sacred texts hidden away from common people because they can't grasp it and reserved for the elite. We now have MRIs that can show us exactly what is happening in the brain. These are real, and there are possibilities for everybody. And Jen and I are going to go into the practicalities of how to get there. And I would like to refer to Richard Davidson's work, and we'll put that in the show notes. His books are fantastic. He's a professor of psychiatry, and the Dalai Lama approached him. He had access to an MRI lab full of machines to study brains. Dalai Lama approached him with his top Buddhist meditators and said to Professor Davidson, will you start studying what's going on? Because these monks are experiencing extraordinary states. And so he did. So check out his videos, check out his books. These are hard facts now, that we are no longer victims of our bad moods, unless we want to be, because with certain practices, we can come right out of that, move into well-being, move into high functioning as kind of a state fluctuation that's sort of stabilizing. And for those folks who really take this seriously, they can stabilize that into a permanent structure of consciousness. So how did I get into this? I've explained in earlier episodes, I've been through several traumas myself, as have Jen. And at my worst, which was a post-medical trauma, a really, really intense trauma, I went into a really bad depression, tried all sorts of meds, and I believe in meds, but the meds didn't work for me. Meds help some people. Not slamming meds at all, medications, but they didn't work for me. And I was getting worse and worse from this postpartum crash from a terrible medical trauma. And the psychiatrist said to me, Sally, there's only one more thing we can do for you, and that's put you on electroconvulsive shock therapy, which shocked me. And I chose not to go that route for my own reasons. But I had to find other ways to recover. This was in the 90s. And so I went on a deep exploration, and I found two psychotechnologies that changed everything for me. And I'm that kind of person that when I find something, I go deep, and I do it every day, and it's really serious for me. I don't mess around. So these practices, which for me turned out to be creativity practice and yoga practice, changed everything. I first of all went from the deep funk, which no one could get me out of after a couple of years. Doctors thought, are we giving up unless you go and have your brain electrocuted, to reconfigure patterns, which is very helpful for some, to oscillating. I moved into an oscillation between ecstasy and funk, which the doctors thought, oh my God, she's moved into bipolar, which wasn't at all. I was misdiagnosed. What it was I was beginning to experience through my practices these glimmers of ecstasy. And then I moved into high functioning. And I would say 20, 30 years later, I am pretty much almost always joyful despite ongoing traumas and challenges. So what's happened is I've been able to master my brain, and we're going to go into that in section 2, how to do that. It's not a mystery anymore. We now have solid practical tools for understanding how to stabilize a brain and how to get it optimally functioning. And why would we do that? It's because when you're in that state of fullness, you can not only live optimally, you can contribute from fullness to society. And you keep filling up your own well. And you're no longer a victim of circumstance. You're actually resilient and in control of how you respond to life. So I would like to just talk briefly about moving from trauma to optimal states of being through creativity. I have mentioned this book. If you'd like to know more about that, it's my book on art making with refugees and survivors that will go into the show notes, because that really, truly helped me. And the book explains how, so I'm not going to go into that now, but creativity practice is a definite psychotechnology. And we're getting more and more evidence of that, as well as meditative practice. Mine happened to be yoga. There's martial arts, there's a bunch of them. I want to end this section by quoting somebody who's one of my favorite contemporary enlightenment teachers, called Thomas Hubl. Thomas is a wonderful teacher. And he's recently moved into understanding art making as a practice because of his wife. And this is what he has to say. The unspoken aspects in the cultural space are represented by art, poetry, music, films as a psychoactive substance. Social healing spaces need to include art because it speaks to our being in a different way than rational words. The mind and knowledge do not run the show. We've spoken about that with Ian McGilchrist's work. And these are not essential elements for the healing process. The top-down suppression by the mind is a trauma defense mechanism. And the mind is not the right way to deal with trauma because it creates more separation. And art does not do that. It opens the heart. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Jen, and we'll go into the more practical aspects of how we can use psychotechnologies for altering states of consciousness deliberately.
Wow. I really appreciate how you are bringing us into the practical science of this. This isn't, it's interesting. And I think we've said this before, how science is catching up to all of these ancient traditions and what we've known for a long time. Those of us who've been into contemplative practices, it is very reassuring to see that science is finally catching up to us. And also thank you, Sally, for sharing your story about how you're the intelligence and wisdom in you that knew that shock technology was not the direction that you literally courted your own dark night so that you could have an awakening that has now blossomed into this beautiful conscious life that you have lived. And so that's a real gift to share with us. You're a real example to me, and I know everybody listening. Yeah, so good. Whew. So let's deep dive into types of peak experiences, or psychotechnologies, as Sally's been pointing us to. And these kind of peak experiences can happen in a variety of ways. One way that we've been pointing to are spiritual peak experiences. And spiritual peak experiences can happen in all kinds of ways. As Sally's been pointing to, meditation, the fMRIs are showing that, improving. The brain lights up on the screen, and it's just beautiful. Contemplative practices can evoke peak experiences. If you've been in a church congregation and you're singing hymns, there's an aliveness that comes over you. And in lots of various spiritual traditions, that singing together creates a kind of increase in ecstasy. Spiritual experiences, peak experiences, can be mystical experiences and like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, ecstatic states. I love ecstatic dance, rituals, revelations, visions, symbolism. In Christianity, there's being touched by the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost, and then there's spiritual awakenings like the one that I had in my backyard. So peak experiences can come through the spiritual experience in a lot of different ways. Then there are plant medicines. They are potent gateways to peak experiences that should be deeply respected. Because when we take psychedelic medicines, we get an altered state of consciousness, and consciousness expands. And many of us are on a healing journey, our transformational journey, that includes these altered states of consciousness through healing through ayahuasca or psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, cannabis. Many people, including myself, receive intense life-saving pain relief from cannabis. The list goes on for really psychoactive compounds that promote healing and pain relief and ultimately transformation. Psychedelic medicine can help people see through the lie of individualism and dissolving the ego. They help with spiritual and personal growth, expanding individual and collective consciousness, healing trauma, especially PTSD. The research is unquestionable that soldiers specifically coming home from war with PTSD are having radical transformations by using psilocybin mushrooms in professional settings. So yeah, very important collection of peak experiences found in plant medicines. And then there's nature's peak experiences, right? Sunrises, sunsets, mountaintop views, waterfalls, stargazing, earthing, walking in the forest, beaches, oceans, clouds. I can't tell you how many times a day here in Florida I offer myself to the clouds. They're just so beautiful, and they just sweep me up into this feeling of just joy and ecstasy. That's a peak experience. And we get a sense of peace in nature. We get reflection and a sense of belonging, right? And we belong in nature because we are nature. And so we get a sense of real joy when we're there in nature or with animals, with our animal kinfolk. And then another kind of peak experience are physical peak experiences. Like so many athletes are very familiar with the feeling of achieving a personal best goal, right? Overcoming a fear. Every time I get into a hot shower, I feel like I have a tiny mini peak experience because I'm just raptured by the warmth of the water and the peace and alignment that I feel in my body when I take a hot shower. So we have all of these peak experiences. And also we have peak experiences when we're creating. Sally is pointing us to the real importance of creativity and peak experience is understanding that these two things go together. Because when we're creating, we're tapping into that flow state where we're just totally immersed in what we're doing. And as artists, we're always trying to tap into that flow. And that is a peak experience where we're transported out of ordinary reality and into an altered state of consciousness. And so it's amazing to me how many ways, how many gateways there are to peak experiences in our ordinary experience, in nature, with writing, creating art, music. These things actually become psychoactive, as Sally's pointing us to. They become psychoactive. And so we're only covering a couple types of peak experiences in this episode, but there's just so many more. And as I mentioned before, we can't be exhaustive in this episode, but I hope that going over these types gives you an awareness of peak experiences, and probably has tapped you into an awareness that you too are having peak experiences in your own life. And so I'm going to pass it back to Sally, and then we're going to go deeper about how we can, really participate with these peak experiences in order to amplify and accelerate, use them as catalysts for our growth and healing. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Sally.
I love your stories, Jen, that you've shared privately too, as well as the public ones, because I consider you to be what I'd call a psychonaut, which is somebody that dives deep into different states and explores them courageously and reaps the benefits. There are a lot of benefits, and we're going to go through that. So just to begin the second section here by qualifying something, we're talking about brain plasticity. So the brain is wired and can be rewired constantly until we die by repeating certain activities. Repetition is how we rewire the brain. That's called brain plasticity. What happens with a peak experience often is it just comes unannounced. And if we're not conscious, we don't even know how it arrived. It feels like an act of grace. It just arrived, it was delicious, and then it left us, and we feel worse than ever because, oh my God, how do I repeat that? I want to repeat that. I want more. And then we get into this desperation. Well, it is available to you at any time, and that's what we're going to talk about now in this section. And if you repeat the state, it eventually becomes a stage. That's the critical differential we're going to talk about now, is the difference between an act of grace that arrives unannounced and leaves, and then we feel desperate and sad after because we want more, and then turning that into a practice so that we can make it permanent. That is the rewiring. It doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it can take years, but we can get there. So these are the 4 things I would like listeners to know about the brain that can be mastered in order to get to stage rather than accidental state. First of all, most folks, if you've been listening up to now, have heard Jen and I talk about the binary nervous system, the 2 ways our nervous system functions. One is fight and flight, and the other is rest and digest. We call that sympathetic is fight, flight, parasympathetic is the rest, digest. So I'm going to go through these briefly, but if you want to Google that, it's important information because flow states only happen in rest and digest. So you've got to know how to navigate that and observe yourself and say, oh my God, I'm in fight and flight. I need to get out of that into parasympathetic. So that's number 1. Number 2, flow states only happen when we are manufacturing our own pharmaceuticals that are optimal. So the body makes happy chemicals, and that's a brilliant hack to Google. The 4 neurotransmitters that will make you happy. So we can learn how to release dopamine through self-care and goal completion. We can release endorphins through exercise, music, and laughter. We can release serotonin through meditation, sunlight, and nature. And we can, of course, release oxytocin when we're socializing and touching, or when we're with pets. So learning how to do those activities, you begin to master the neurotransmitting chemicals, the happy ones. Flow states only happen when those are being released. So that's number 2. Number 3 is brainwaves. And this is definitely worth learning more about. And I'm sorry we need to only look at this briefly, but there are 5 different brainwaves with different levels of frequency of oscillation. There's gamma, beta, alpha, theta, and delta. So gamma, we don't know too much about. Sometimes it's tricky. We're only just beginning to research that it can be beneficial for some diseases. Sometimes it's actually evident that it can lead to schizophrenia, blah, blah. So don't worry about gamma. Beta is when you're stressing out in the traffic going to the office. It's quite a high little oscillation, and it's a level of anxiety. Then there's alpha. You come down slower, and you're gardening, you're lying in the bathtub, you're very relaxed. Perfect. You can come down even slower into theta, which is a long, slow oscillation. That is where your imagination and creativity is at. You can be waking up from sleep or going down into sleep, and you can harvest the most creative ideas when you know when your brain is in theta, when you're observing your brain and you're deliberately giving time for that depth of slow oscillation. And then there's delta when you're asleep, but your brain is really active and it's dreaming. And if you can harvest those dreams, there's a lot you can process too, but that's a very slow, long, undulating brainwave, just above being brain dead. So that's number 3. If you can learn to manage your brain and go into theta or alpha as much as possible, you can enter flow. And I would say the last thing, number 4, is managing your left and right brain. That means doing different tasks. We've spoken, Jen and I, ad nauseum on our podcast about that. Left brain is analysis, convergent thinking. There's only one answer. It's quite stressful. You're probably in beta and you're probably in fight and flight. Right brain activities like imagining, painting, cooking, big picture thinking, meditation, you're probably in the relaxed nervous system. You're probably in alpha or theta, and you're doing what we call divergent thinking. So those are the 4 things to go Google if you want to manage and master states. That is nervous system, it is happy chemicals, it's brain waves, and it's right brain activity. If you are, let's imagine, skiing down a slope, and you've got enough discipline and mastery that you're no longer in fight and flight because you're not scared of falling, and you surrender to that flow down the hill, you get into the zone, it's called. And suddenly you're in ecstasy. All those 4 things are converging at that moment. You're in a state of flow, and if you go back through what I said, you're in parasympathetic, you're in alpha or theta, and you're doing a wide, big picture, soft focus, the right brain, and you're in flow. That is the optimal state. It arrives suddenly if you don't know how to get into it, or you can start practicing it daily, putting yourself in a situation where you can rewire the brain over and over until you live in a state of flow. Flow is when your skill level exactly matches the level of challenge. If the skill level is higher than the challenge, you're bored. If the skill level is lower than the challenge, you're stressed. So we call that the actual presence, is that your body is in complete sync with its environment at that point. So lots to think about. We've only dipped into it like a little smorgasbord. It's worth exploring more. And I'm going to hand it back to you now, Jen.
You know what I love so much is that we get into the flow state here. We do it together. We are in complete alignment. And every show, we're not quite sure how it's going to unfold. And then by the end of it, we're both enraptured and kind of in this state of ecstasy by the end of it. So we're doing it. We're in the flow right here on the Radical Emergence podcast. And I think that's just wonderful. Yeah. So how do we navigate these peak experiences more effectively, whether they're, thrust upon us unexpectedly or we're courting them in some of the ways that we've already talked about? How can we start to use them as catalysts for our journey of transformation? And as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, without proper supports, these experiences can and do become problematic for a lot of people. So alongside that interest in peak experiences, we are equally interested in providing ourselves the proper supports, professional supports, settings that we need for these experiences so that the harm doesn't outweigh the good. So Maslow theorized that everybody has peak experiences, but he said that those who he called self-actualized are more prone to having a peak experience. And I'm not sure that I agree with that, because I believe that wherever we are within that spectrum of growth and actualization, we can and do experience profound moments that are fulfilling and transformative and meaningful. At the same time, I also feel like the more we're growing and changing consciously as self-aware people, we become more prone to these kinds of experiences, and we become more skillful at navigating them, right? So, and then hopefully our hearts are expanding in such a way that we're starting to support others who are navigating their own peak experiences, just like Sally and I are doing on this podcast, because that love is a natural outgrowth of transformation, of course. And that's really the kind of healing communities that we need to foster if we're going to survive and thrive in these post-normal transformative times. So whether these experiences happen when they least expect to, like when I had that breakdown in my backyard where I was thrust into transformation through the doorway of desperation, I wasn't looking for a breakdown. I wasn't looking for a breakthrough. I wasn't looking for an awakening, but that is what arose. That's what came out of that. But then, like we mentioned, there's those peak experiences that happen that we're consciously doing, like when we're making art or we're using plant medicines, moving with these experiences and mining them for the wisdom within them so that we can move with the momentum of transformation. That is powerful work. And it's easy to get overwhelmed if we're doing that kind of work. So if you're out there listening and you're doing this work, we hope you know you're not alone. We are with you. Nature is standing with you. The trees are standing with you. The entire universe is cheering you on along in these transformative experiences, because your transformation is our transformation. My transformation is your transformation. And our goal is navigating these transformative experiences, whether they're thrust upon us or chosen. Our goal is to navigate them efficiently, effectively, generatively. So it's important that we reflect on the insights that they bring us, that we identify the patterns and themes that are arising through these peak experiences, that we set goals, that we set goals that are aligned with the insights that arise, that we are integrating these experiences. I've been integrating that experience now for well over a decade, and I probably will be integrating it for the rest of my life. This journey of transformation is precious, and we are really fortunate to share this podcast with you, share our journeys of transformation with you. And truly, the most precious gift that we can give each other is our own time and attention. And you've given Sally and I that over many episodes, and today with this episode, and we are grateful. So I'm going to end there and say goodbye, pass it back to Sally. We wish you well, and we look forward to being with you next time on the Radical Emergence podcast. Be well.
Yeah, Jen, I think it's so important what you mentioned about integration. So that makes me think I just want to speak a tiny bit into the importance of integration, specifically with psychedelics. So we can get little glimmers of this ecstasy by ingesting substances. And there's now tons of research out there that's really helpful. For example, microdosing with psilocybin for trauma. There are ketamine clinics that have been set up for long-term chronic trauma. You can have that drip ingested through a drip. The occasional purge with ayahuasca rituals. These can all reformulate the brain patterns, and that's why they're so helpful, because we can have ossified structures and old defunct patterns that don't serve us anymore, but we get into a pattern. So these things can startle us into a whole new paradigm. And there is evidence that alcohol and THC are depressants, so I wouldn't recommend those if you are seeking an insight through psychedelics. I would recommend going to a clinic that has trained people to help you integrate what comes up, because it can actually be, you can have some psychotic breaks if you don't do that. So wonderful new science showing how psychedelics can help under the right circumstances, with the right dosage, with the right people helping you integrate afterwards. Critical. I would like to read one quote from a long-term meditator who doesn't believe that these are helpful. Jen and I believe they are helpful. The only thing is, if you're still relying on an external substance that you ingest, you're not liberated yet from your external circumstances. You can stimulate your own pharmacology through meditation, and that means you're liberated from relying on something that you put into your body. So this is Jen and I think psychotechnology is wonderful in all its forms. Meditation is the one that helps you be independent and master it completely. So Gopi Krishna, the long-term meditator, felt strongly that this is a step better than taking psychedelics. So I'm going to read that. You can take it or leave it. He has written many books. He's worth looking at. He would consider himself to have had a shocking example of a sudden transformation that he took years to integrate. Kundalini arising. And he's worth looking at to understand how you can have a sudden awakening, which can be pretty terrifying and needs integrating. He says this: if drugs could induce the same state of divine inspiration characterized by Buddha, Socrates, Christ, Shankaracharya, St. Paul, Rumi, Guru Nanak, St. Francis of Assisi, and other great prophets and mystics of the past, the present world would be crowded with models of perfection and sublime vision, making it a happier world to live in. But on the contrary, what we see is a singular absence of these lofty men and women, and it is our distorted thinking confusing drug experience with permanent mystical experience. I think that's extreme. I would say that psychedelics give us transient, temporary states. Meditation gives us stages. So I wouldn't condemn anything. Gopi would condemn it. So it's worth looking at different perspectives. And I've certainly had yoga teachers who said, stay away from it. You want to master your brain yourself. You don't want to be shopping for a product that can get you there. I don't agree, but there's two sides to this. So I would like to end with a study that I'm going to put in the show notes that was done on some Buddhist meditators. This is different from the Richard Davidson study. This is a new study. They looked at brains that had been doing a practice that was 2,000 years old. And this is what they measured. The actual metrics for states of enlightenment. This is what it feels like for those who haven't had a glimmer yet. Your internal verbalizations fade to stillness. So there's no thought. Your personal boundaries are altered and there's no ego separation. Your attention is highly focused, but also soft and diffuse. There's a sense of timelessness and coherence like never before. There is great bliss. And we're not sure if that's dopamine or if it's an internal opioid that gets released. People focus on the pituitary gland, which explodes people into ecstasy. So there's a biofeedback that makes you want to do it again. Your external awareness is fairly dimmed and you become really present. It's almost like nothing exists. And the great thing is that entry and exit into the state becomes volitional and by choice. It's no longer accidental. You can get there at will at any time. That is freedom. That is liberation. And you don't have to go shopping or go to the jungle to find your products. You can do it yourself on your mat. So this has been an amazing episode. I'd like to say again that for Jen and I, getting our first glimmers of ecstasy took us on a whole lifelong journey into understanding what the hell happened. What saved us? I could say for myself from suicide. I can be honest about that. And that was 25, 30 years ago. I've never looked back. So it's a journey worth investigating. Mastery is possible, and it's the path to freedom. I look forward to seeing you again soon. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us. This is life-changing, and we're going to put some of the citations and references in the show notes if you want to look at some more. And we've got another 8 or so episodes to share with you. Come back. We love having you here, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye. So thanks for joining us. And we hope you can take away some helpful tools, perhaps some great stories, and some wisdom for your own ongoing journey.
Join us for our next episode, where we will deep dive again into a universe of transformation.